Good morning. My name is Heather Harris, and I'm a research fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program featuring findings from PPIC's latest report, Pandemic Policymaking and Changed Outcomes in Criminal Courts. During today's briefing, I will present the main findings from our report and then answer any questions that you, our audience, might have. Before I begin, I need to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's event is supported with funding from the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle. The report and slides from today's briefing can be found on our website at ppic.org. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. Finally, if you have a question about the report findings, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Along with your question, please include your name and your organization. And with that, I'll share my screen and get started. At the beginning of the pandemic, I noticed that courts were struggling to determine how to adjust to pandemic conditions and how to communicate what they were doing to the public. When this project got started about a year later, I therefore set out to answer three questions. How had the pandemic impacted criminal courts? What policy changes did courts make in order to adjust to pandemic conditions? And what effect did those policy changes have on criminal defendants, that is, the people who experience those policies? If you remember back to 2020, the public health threat posed by the pandemic loomed large, especially early on. People in institutions like the criminal justice system responded. Primarily, people stayed home, both of their own volition and in response to public health mandates. The police also sought to protect themselves and the public by reducing in-person interactions, and many, though not all, of California's criminal courts closed, at least for some time. These changes profoundly impacted the criminal justice system. In March of 2020, arrest rates plummeted 57% relative to 2018, and arrest rates stayed low throughout 2020. They stayed about 30% lower than they had been in 2018. In addition, criminal cases were less likely to complete within 6 months. The rates at which courts resolved criminal cases through conviction, dismissal, or acquittal fell by as much as 80% for some crimes. And throughout 2020, case resolution rates remained about half what they were before the pandemic. Since criminal courts resolved cases more slowly than police made arrests, a large backlog of criminal cases accumulated. This figure illustrates the estimated number of cases that would have completed within 6 months, but did not. By December 2020, at least 55,000 criminal cases were backlogged. In addition, the composition of the backlog shifted as the year progressed. In March of 2020, about 1/3 of the backlog cases were felonies. But by December, nearly half were, and that's because felonies sometimes take longer to complete than misdemeanors do. In order to adjust the conditions that led to the backlog, courts changed how they operate. In California, courts are governed by a policymaking body called the Judicial Council. Very early in the pandemic, the council recognized the need to modify operations, both to protect public health and to maintain public safety. In order to do that, the courts adopted three main policies. Zero bail policies were instituted by states and individual counties. These policies helped reduce the number of people incarcerated in jails. Extending case processing times allowed courts to accommodate the delays associated with protecting public health and complying with public health mandates. Conducting hearings remotely allowed criminal cases to proceed while avoiding the in-person interactions that we knew were facilitating virus transmission. Except for a very brief period when zero bail was imposed statewide, counties could decide whether and how to implement pandemic policies. As a result, the counties varied in whether, when, and for how long they implemented these policies. In fact, no two counties had the same policy environment during 2020. This figure shows the number of days that remote hearings were allowed in each county during 2020, and it illustrates the wide variation in how long remote hearings implied. Of the 58 counties, 9 counties never adopted a remote hearing policy. At the other end of the spectrum, 20 counties allowed remote hearings for 9 months or more. Differential adoption of pandemic policies, coupled with geographic variation in where people live, led to differences in how people were treated by the criminal justice system. For example, during 2020, about half of all arrests made across the state were made when a remote hearing policy was in place. But Black and Latino people were more likely than other people of other races to experience remote hearing policies. More than half of all arrests of Black and Latino people were made under a remote hearing policy. By contrast, less than half of the arrests of people of other races were made under remote hearing policies. And similar conclusions apply to zero bail and arraignment extension policies. Black and Latino people were more likely than people of other races to be affected by them. One reason I focus on remote hearings, both in the report and in today's briefing, is that they remain in place today. The other policies do not. Legislation enacted in 2021 allowed courts to conduct remote hearings, except felony trials, remotely. At least 2 bills currently under consideration could extend remote hearing policies or change which hearings can be heard virtually. Therefore, understanding remote hearing policies and how they impacted the outcomes of criminal cases can help policymakers make informed decisions about whether and how they should continue. Before I talk about the findings, it's important to understand a key limitation of my analysis. I do not know whether the hearings associated with each criminal case were conducted remotely. Instead, I know whether a policy was in place that allowed them to be. Therefore, what the research shows is how the policy and not the practice of allowing remote hearings affected outcomes. In particular, when remote hearing policies were in place, rates of conviction within 6 months of arrest fell an average of 1.4 percentage points across the board. Conviction rates also varied by race. Only white, Latino, and Black people experienced statistically significant impacts. Among those arrested for misdemeanors, Black people experienced the largest decrease in conviction rates of 2.2 percentage points. On the felony side, white people experienced the largest decrease, 1.7 percentage points. Remote hearing policies also affected how people were sentenced. Under them, misdemeanor convictions were more likely to result in non-custodial sanctions, so things like probation, fines, and restitution, and they were less likely to lead to jail time. Additionally, people convicted of felonies were more likely to be sentenced to jail and less likely to be sentenced to prison. These impacts offset each other almost perfectly. Specifically, under remote hearing policies, misdemeanor convictions were 2 percentage points less likely to lead to jail and 1 percentage point more likely to lead to probation or money sanctions. For felonies, convictions were 1.6 percentage points more likely to lead to jail and 1.5 percentage points less likely to lead to prison. Although I don't show this on the slide, people of different races also experience different sentencing impacts. For example, the felony sentencing impacts were concentrated among Black people. Black people were 4 percentage points more likely to receive jail and 3.8 percentage points less likely to go to prison under remote hearing policies. Remote hearing policies also contributed to race differences in case outcomes. During 2020, Latino people were more likely than white people to be convicted, and remote hearing policies explained 13% of that difference. By contrast, Black people were less likely to be convicted than white people, and remote hearings also accounted for some of that difference, about 8% of it. Other factors also explain race differences in outcomes. They include things like people's prior criminal history and their current charges and where their charges are adjudicated. In conclusion, this PPIC research shows that remote hearings do more than facilitate access to the courts. They affect how courts treat people. One commonly cited advantage of remote hearings is that they broaden access to courts. And they do that by helping people overcome some of the challenges to appearing in person. Those challenges include things like having access to transportation and being able to get time off of work. The trade-off here is that remote hearings also impact case outcomes. Conviction rates fell and sentencing patterns changed under remote hearing policies. Remote hearing policies also impacted equity in these outcomes, and the equity impacts can be difficult to unpack. So before the pandemic, California's criminal justice system produced racially inequitable outcomes, and those outcomes shifted during the pandemic. So when those shifts happened, there were winners and there were losers. And policymakers need to consider these wins and losses as they consider whether to continue remote hearing policies. Finally, why remote hearing policies produce these impacts is unclear, and more research can help us answer the question of how remote hearings affect outcomes. Specifically, future research into the impact of remote hearings on criminal case outcomes should focus on arraignments. In the modern criminal justice system, most conviction and sentencing outcomes are determined through plea bargaining. Fewer than 3% of criminal defendants in California see trial, but all of them appear to face charges. Whether this research can occur in California will hinge on addressing some limitations of California's criminal justice data. Currently, the California's data are missing several key pieces of information. Specifically, it would be helpful to know whether hearings are held remotely or in person, as I did not. Similarly, California lacks information about whether arrests lead to prosecution, whether defendants are detained after they are arraigned, and whether people fail to appear if they are released. Collecting this information could help us understand the impacts of remote hearing policies and other criminal justice policies. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. So the first question I see is, do I know if the courts have resolved the backlog? And I don't know if they have completely resolved the backlog, but I do know that they have worked through most of it. The second question is, do you know why policy uptake differed so much across the counties? We don't know perfectly why policy uptake differed so much. So one of the things I know from reading all of the court orders that were issued is that pandemic conditions were the major driver of whether specific policies were instituted or not. So when the presiding judge in each county was issuing these orders, what they typically did was cite pandemic conditions and then say what they were going to do in order to adjust to them. So you could see policies being implemented and then taken away as coronavirus waves ebbed and crested. The third question is, are there impacts for Asian Americans or Native Americans? So because these are smaller populations in California, it's hard to detect statistically significant effects. But when you look across the different impacts, their effects are trending in the same direction as those that we reported. So they too have lower conviction rates and their sentencing patterns change, and they change in similar directions. So another question asks a methodological question. So are conviction rates relative to prosecutions or arrests? They are relative to arrests. So the data that we used for this study is the California Automated Criminal History System data from the Department of Justice. And those data do not contain reliable information about whether arrests were prosecuted or not. And so all of the conviction rates that we report are relative to arrest. Again, if you have a question for me, you can submit it at ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. It's all one word. And you should see the email address on the screen. So a viewer in Sacramento asks, how do you know that other factors besides these court policies didn't affect differences in sentencing rates? So one of the things that gives us confidence in our estimates is that no two counties had the same policy environment. So counties adopted remote hearing policies and other pandemic policies differently. As I said in the presentation, none of the counties duplicated each other. And so what this means is that we're able to use the differential timing of the implementation of these policies in order to estimate the effects. And for something else to be causing them would mean that the same thing would have to be acting across the different counties to counteract it at all of these different times. And that just seems unlikely. So Lester Purple in Mono County, who I think were responding to our court survey, asked, do we have any stats about California counties offering remote hearing policies currently? I don't have any current data on that. So what the people who responded to the court survey told me was that courts seem to be using remote hearings or relying on them a little bit less than they had been, especially during these early days of the pandemic. But I don't know if that is true or if it remains true. It was just the consensus from what people told me. So a viewer in Sacramento is asking, some of the findings of racial differences seem to be smaller percentage val smaller percentage values than the margin of error of 5%. Does that mean these findings are inconclusive? And the answer is no. So what we report are percentage points, and they're different than percentages. So a percentage point difference, so say you have a 1 percentage point difference, but your baseline percentage is, so there's a 90% probability. Moving from 90 to 91% is, just that 1% difference. But if you are from, say, 10 to 11%, that's a 10% difference. So you have to recognize that the percentage points differences that we report are not the same thing as percents. A viewer asked, what were my expectations related to your findings of racial disparities, and did those results align with those? So one of the things about the research into remote hearings is there isn't that much, particularly with respect to criminal case outcomes. So your conviction outcomes or your sentencing outcomes. No prior research has been able to estimate these impacts. And so I didn't have strong prior expectations. So what I hoped was that they might be narrowing disparities. But as I said, there's a lot of variation in California in terms of, who is more and less likely to be convicted or who is more and less likely to be sentenced. And so how to balance who wins and loses is actually like a bit of a challenge. And it will be a challenge for policymakers to decide how they want to weigh what has happened as they move into the future. Again, if you have additional questions, you can message them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. A viewer asked, could you talk more about the differences between policies and practices? How did practices change when policies for remote hearings were in place? Again, like that varied a lot by county. But so what I mean by the difference between policies and practices is the courts could institute a remote hearing policy. So that allowed remote hearings to take place. But whether they did or not was variable. So in some counties defaulted to remote hearing. So unless you requested an exception, your hearing was held remotely. And other counties, you had to opt in to remote hearing policies. So people had to actually request to have their case heard remotely. And, this was kind of true and varied across the counties in different ways. So just because a remote hearing policy was in place doesn't necessarily mean a remote hearing policy was what happened in an individual criminal case. You know, there were, there were other changes in terms of practices as well. So in combination with the other pandemic policies, some cases were more or less likely to be heard remotely. So zero bail policies released people mainly who had committed misdemeanors and lower level felonies. That meant that people who were incarcerated during the pretrial period were incarcerated in jail, and they were more likely to have been accused of a felony. And so we saw a little bit of a differentiation with respect to whether or not cases were heard remotely, depending on whether you were held in custody. And that's because, the criminal justice system could control that remote process. Whereas, on the outside, if you were released on the outside, if you didn't have remote access, you didn't have remote access. I have another question here. Did you look at the family law and civil backlog? What are your thoughts about their impact on criminal calendars? I did not look at the family law and civil backlog. And so unfortunately, I don't really have a research basis to answer that question. According to the Judicial Council, being allowed to conduct cases remotely across the board did help clear the backlogs. It just didn't seem that remote hearing policies were necessarily instituted to do that. And some counties specifically said that holding cases remotely wouldn't help them clear the backlog. Okay, it looks like we don't have any more questions. I will thank you all for coming today. Just one second, I have my talking points. So with that, we've reached the end of our program. I'd like to thank our funders for supporting today's program, and I thank all of you for joining me and the PPIC team online. If you pre-registered for this event, later today you'll receive a survey, and we would appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to respond to let us know how we did. Please be safe and have a wonderful afternoon.